大家平安。亚拿国际侍奉在3月18号举办了撒玛利亚犹大地线上讲座，题目是危机中持守对神的信，也就是 Judea and Samaria, Faith in the Midst of Crisis。在现场的时候，我们因为时间有限，没有办法请讲员针对我们的一些问题来回答。我们也另外收集了一些弟兄姊妹来的问题，这些问题都非常的棒。在下面呢，讲员有非常详尽的回答跟解说，所以是一个非常棒的一个分享，请大家抱着祷告的心一起来听，也一起来学习。我们感谢神的心意在我们当中成就，愿我们一起来支持撒玛利亚犹大地的安全设备，保守当地百姓的性命，愿他们能够持续的站在神的心意当中，愿神在撒玛利亚犹大地的旨意行在地上，如同行在天上。
Okay, first question. Since the security needs in this area is so critical, why doesn't the government take good care of it? They are all Israeli citizens. You are entitled to have the same protection as people in other areas, right? Or are you governed by another law? Because of the sensitivity in the nations, UN, US, could you explain it more clearly to us? Shmuel.
So I would definitely say that we are protected and the army is doing everything possible to protect the area. We have thousands of soldiers, and this is probably one of the complaints against our area, that we have too many soldiers. It makes sense. We live in a very condensed area, and we're surrounded by hostile villages. We live with Palestinians all around us. Literally, I look at the window right now and I see we are surrounded. And therefore, there is always a need for security. So from the get-go, this question maybe implies that we don't have protection. It is not true. We do have the army surrounding us and guarding us, and we have soldiers everywhere. It is not enough. It is not enough because we are surrounded. And you cannot post a soldier that's literally going to stand every couple of meters and guard us. So there are many ways to attack us in the area, unfortunately. There are the roads, there are the communities, a lot of area, a lot of population. Therefore, everything that is being given by the IDF is just simply not enough. Not because they don't want to do more, it's because it's not enough, and we need also to contribute. So there's two ways that the communities also participate. Number one, every community has another first response team from the civilians of the community. And we are there because in the case of something happens, and we've learned it in the South in the 7th of October, the army cannot be anywhere at all time. We need to be there, the first response to react in the case that something happened. And number two, of course, this is the layer of CFOIC. And just the understanding that we can also contribute with equipment, with just ways to protect the communities, from cameras to drones to night vision goggles, things that always give the extra layer of protection. And thank God, and I need to say that because at this time we see it every week or two, we see how the equipment that is given by CFOIC is actually able to save lives. So there's layers here. There's layers of protection, the army, the civilians, and the extra layers of ways to protect from the communities from us. So thank God, but we need more.
Well, I just want to add a little story that I think will illustrate this. The community of Adorah was attacked a few weeks ago. Now, about a year ago, they requested that we provide them with surveillance cameras. This request came as a result of a consultation between the civilian security officer who is responsible for that region, employed by the municipality, and the army, and the officers in the army who are responsible for that area. As a result of their recommendations, the community was asked to see if they could provide us security cameras and a fence. Now, the government said, we can provide the money for the fence, but we cannot provide the money for the cameras. We just don't have enough. But we recommend that you get the cameras. And that's exactly where CFOIC came in. We provided the cameras. And then a few weeks ago, when terrorists tried to enter the community, it was as a result of these cameras that they were stopped, that the first responders got there first, thanks to some of the equipment that was purchased for them by CFOIC, if we're talking about night vision goggles, or if we're talking about, just regular fleece jackets, things like this. They're already equipped with guns that are provided by the Army. They get there first, and then the Army gets there soon after and takes over the event. And that's just a perfect example of what Shmuel has been talking about now. Okay. Next question. How many Israeli citizens are there living in this area? How many MKs represent you? Or do you have a special party as your mouthpiece in the Knesset? So I'll tackle this question. There are about 500,000 Jews now living in Judea and Samaria. In this country, we do not have regional representation in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. Instead, we have parties that run with lists of members of Knesset that they want to run. Everybody votes in the country for a particular party, and based upon the proportional representation that each party receives from the entire country, each party then gets the certain number of seats. Now, there are certain parties that are definitely appealing to those people, not only who live in Judea and Samaria, but people who live all over the country, but who support the right of Jews to live in Judea and Samaria. So the Likud has traditionally represented this. And then there's a number of parties to the right of the Likud, such as Religious Zionism, who represent that as well. And there's even people in parties in the center that have individual members of Knesset, someone like Matan Kahana, who represent support for Judea and Samaria as well. So while we don't have our own party and we don't have our own MKs, there are many, many MKs that support our interests, and these are people we can go to if we need to have a particular issue put forward in the Knesset.
And just let's mention the fact that we have a couple of MKs who live in Judea and Samaria in a nearby community, right? We have Dumim. We have a member, we have in Rimonim, we have in Efrat, and we have in Hebron. We have like 3, which is like, there's a lot of them. So it's a combination. And I think many of the MKs, even if they live in Judea and Samaria, they're not differentiated. They're just MKs and they live in the region. And you can live without the region and live outside and still representing and be part of it. So it's like the ideology, not necessarily the geography in this case.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Because of war, we see Israel economic needs. Due to the BDS in the recent years on Samaria and Judea, is it even more difficult for people during the war? How can we help the businesses there? Any recommendations?
Right. So I actually want to say something that might be even surprising. I don't think there's a problem right now because of BDS. If there's a problem right now, is because people are over flooded with the fact they went to reserve, and people are not working in the area and don't have the capacity in their mind to sell in their business. And I think, I have a couple of friends who are in businesses in Judea and Samaria. And right now, what they say is like, we're lacking workers because of the security issues here. There's a lot of boundaries of who can come and work. And it's important to note, when we're talking about industrial areas here in Judea and Samaria, people constantly talk about there's a separation, there's an apartheid. Listen, you go to an industrial area in Judea and Samaria, and the Palestinians from the village that literally are going to attack you can come and work in our facilities, right? I'm going to repeat this because it's mind-blowing. You go to industry area like Barkan, okay? There were terror attacks in the area by workers there, and still they continue to work. The truth is that the Palestinians of the region, many of them work with Jewish people, with Israelis here in the region. Now, what happened? After the 7th of October, there were many places that there were limitations. We were scared, and you would need to think or rethink the fact that you bring people in to work with you. And the army had limitations and said, we need to stop. We need to screen more. We need to check who's coming in. So those factories lost a lot of their manpower. And I think the industry now suffers from lack of manpower. One, because Palestinians who didn't came to work. And number two, many of the men went for reserve and were just dealing at the army and protecting the nation and not in their business. So specifically right now, it's not the story of a BDS. How you can support it. There are many online platforms. I'm just going to name one. They're friends, and I think they're doing a great job. Blessed by Israel, just one example. Okay, they have an online supermarket that sells stuff. Now, these are our friends from Taiwan. They live in the US. I don't know how exactly it works, but they are industries and there are online marketplaces for to sell stuff. And Sandra, we need to say it because here in CFOAC, we always talked about it. We need also to be a vehicle to that. Because look how many people want to support. We need to connect between the communities and what they sell here to the world. So that's another thing that we need to think about.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, there's an organization in Holland that many, many years ago, before there was BDS, but at that point, this was in the 70s, there was another type of boycott against Israel. And they started something they call the Israel Product Center. It's in the Netherlands. The name of the organization is Christians for Israel. And what they do is they have this center, which originally was just a shop. Now it's a shop plus an online business. And what they do is they come to Israel and they visit different suppliers and they order things. They work like a business, but they're selling Israel products. Now, this is something that if there was an initiative in Taiwan, this is something that we would be very, very interested in connecting you with those businesses. You know, send a few buyers here to Israel on a trip of this sort, and we can connect you to many businesses who export and set up your own Israel Product Center. I think that would be an amazing way to help Judea and Samaria and Israel in general. And just one more thing that I want to add, there are two main industries that really are suffering all over the country because of the war, not because of BDS, but because of the war. And that's tourism and building. Tourism, because tourists are not coming to Israel, and I understand that because it's a war. And building, because as Shmuel mentioned, this is one of the sectors where Palestinian Arabs make up a very large percentage of the workforce. And so what has happened as a result of that is that building has slowed down almost to a halt all over the country, but particularly in Judea and Samaria as well. And this is something for us that's very sensitive because we always feel like we're racing against the clock. We need to grow our communities faster than the world can try to impose boycotts and pressure. And so that's one place where Judea and Samaria has been affected, but where you can help is to come to Israel. I don't think this is the time to have a tourist trip. We just completed a very successful solidarity mission, and I would love to see a group of people from Taiwan come on a solidarity mission. It's a smaller group, and what you have is the opportunity to meet the people who have been most affected by this war and who have most involved in this war, and you will go back to Taiwan with a far better understanding of what's happening in Israel today.
That's a brilliant idea. Absolutely.
Okay, next question. As we know, most of the Israelis are secular. Has the current war with Hamas prompted the secular Israelis to seek God? Are there many or just a few? Will you tell us your observation? So I would love to address that question. First of all, what does it mean when people say an Israeli is secular? And here I think there's a difference of definition. It's very important to clarify. In Judaism, one of the main guidelines that people use to determine to what extent a Jew is a religious or non-religious Jew has nothing to do with how much he believes and has much more to do with how much he observes. And so because we have all sorts of very specialized commandments, all of which are anchored in the Bible. But for example, on the Sabbath, we don't work. If you're religious, we don't work. We don't travel in our car. We don't turn on the television or the computer. That's a very specific kind of practice. We are also keep the dietary laws. So there's things we eat and the things we don't eat. Okay. So people who are defined as religious are people who not only believe in God and not only pray every day, but they are keeping all these commandments. You have most Israelis, though, are believing in God. Most Israelis pray, not necessarily every day, but from time to time. There is almost no Israeli who wasn't praying who was a soldier going into war. There are almost no Israelis who don't say at some time or other when they're talking about the situation that they're not saying, please God, praise God, God willing. These are very, very ordinary expressions in everyday conversation, which you will hear on the television, you'll hear on the radio, and you'll just hear, walking in the streets. So if you had to ask me today, how many Israelis are truly secular, let's say before the war, I would say about 25%. 75% of the country is some level of believing, traditional, has some kind of relationship with God. Okay. So what are we seeing since the war? We're seeing more outward expressions of that. And I think we may also be seeing some of those 25% secular moving a little closer to a relationship with God. How are we seeing this? So first of all, many of us saw these kind of films on WhatsApp, on the YouTube, etc. Soldiers before they're going for a mission, gathering around and the commander reciting a prayer and everybody, either saying amen or praying along with them. This was very common. Now, I have a son who, thank God, is home now from the army, but he was drafted on October 7th and was in Gaza for a good part of the 4 months that he was in the army. For about 2.5 months or 3 months, he was in Gaza itself fighting. And he was telling me all kinds of stories of soldiers who really had no connection with God or a synagogue, asking him, can you show me how to pray? What are you saying in your prayer book? Can you show it to me? Asking questions like this, discussions of faith that are taking place as they're hunkered down in a house in Gaza. These are stories and these are situations that we're hearing about all the time. And I think it comes from the Jewish nature. The Jews have always been the people of God. And even though there's some people who've gone very far from God, down deep in our souls, there's a spark there. And all we need is to ignite it. And I think what we're seeing today is more and more ignitions of that spark.
That's so true, everything you said. But I want to add one component. I think that that everybody felt. On the 7th of October, the attack started in the south. And these communities over there, they were extreme secular, as you mentioned. They weren't religious, and there weren't settlers in the state that they didn't live in an area that there's any confusion about or dispute like Judea and Samaria. And there was a notion, and I think a lot of the world feels that Israelis in that part of Israel, maybe even Tel Aviv, just as a word that Tel Aviv represents this secular area, they always want to feel that we are like every citizen of the world. We are a Jewish people, but we are affiliated just like the people who live in Melbourne, Australia, or in New York or in London, international type of people. But the attack really, after all, represented the fact that we cannot forget for 1 second that our enemy wants us because we are Jews. It was a war about our identity. It's a war and the attack that started not because we did something to attack, okay? We didn't do anything. We left the area. We were sitting quietly, want to live life like anywhere else in the world. It's not going to be good enough. You need to always remember, why are you here in this land? And you need to remember that the war is a war about your identity and about our destiny in the area. So people woke up that day and understood, it's not London here, it's not New York. We need to understand why are we here and fight for our existence. And I think that's another wake-up call many of these so-called secular people got, to really question their identity and why are they even here in the land. And I think everything you said with this rising up to the occasion was very true.
Okay, great. Next question. Jews who reside in Judea and Samaria are Israeli citizens, but as far as I know, their rights and duties are different from those who reside in other parts of Israel. Will you tell us what are the differences? Okay, so let me attack this one. The difference is, first and foremost, that Judea and Samaria has never been annexed to Israel, or as another way of putting it, Israeli sovereignty has never been extended to include Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria was illegally occupied by Jordan before 1967. Jordan attacked Israel from this area in 1967, and as a result, Israel took possession of Judea and Samaria. At that point, Israel could have annexed the area, and there would have been a basis for that under international law. But as a result of international pressure that began even before the war was over in 1967, Israel refrained from doing that. So today, the legal status in Judea and Samaria is as administered territory. Okay, now, under international law, we have the right to live there as Jews for many reasons, and this is not the time to go into all those issues, but as Israeli citizens and as Jews, we have every right to live in these areas, and all of our communities have been built and located on public land. No land was ever confiscated from an Arab. The land that we have to build our communities are land that we have been checking very carefully to make sure it doesn't belong to anybody. Okay, so there have been a series of laws that have been passed in order to figure out, well, then what exactly is the status of Israeli citizens who are living in Jewish communities not under Israeli sovereignty. And so what has happened most of the time is that without actually applying sovereignty, Israel has applied the rule of Israeli law to these Jewish communities. So in just about every case, I am, for example, if I'm driving on a road and I'm speeding, an Israeli policeman could give me a speeding ticket and I will have the same obligation to pay that ticket. I have the same obligation to pay taxes. I have the same obligation, in all these other ways. And by the same token, the Israeli government has the same obligation to provide security protection, education, and all sorts of municipal services. On that, there's absolutely no difference. In the legal terminology, there is differences, but in other places, there are no differences. But there are certain more complicated issues where that difference comes into play, and one of that has to be with the status of the land. It is much more difficult for me to just go and buy a piece of land and say, okay, I bought a piece of land and I'm going to build a house on it. It is also much more difficult for an Israeli community whose municipal boundaries have already been set. And there's, let's say, a whole area of land where the community decides, the mayor decides, I want to build a new neighborhood here. We're going to put up another 50 houses, put a playground. That whole process is far more complicated because we are not part of official Israeli sovereignty.
What can I add? We pay tax, we pay the police receipts, and we cannot build and do whatever we want. Like good of all the worlds.
Absolutely. Okay, next. I learned that some new immigrants who are secular became religious after living in Israel for a few years. Is this true? Why is it the case? How frequent is the case?
So I must say that I haven't heard specifically of a phenomenon. I would say that it just makes sense. If you heard of it, it makes sense, and I'll explain why. Immigrants, by their definition, right, they came to Israel with a cause, with a belief, Again, immigration all over the world is a difficult thing, right? It's a topic to immigrate and to change, the language, the surrounding area with all the obstacles and all the challenges is always difficult. It's always challenging. There is a phenomenon in Israel with a lot of immigration that comes from purely a religious perspective and a belief perspective, and not because I got a new opportunity for a relocation, right? I myself, had an experience living outside of Israel, and always the feeling was that everybody around you was looking for a better future for themselves and for the kids. This is a relocation. We're not talking about a relocation. When a Jew comes to Israel, or as we do, makes aliyah, okay, he decides to come to Israel more than anything because of the ideology of what it means to, after waiting for 2,000 years in exile and having an opportunity to come live in the land. The truth is, Sandra also can share about it. The move of being born somewhere else and change everything, leave the family, and opening and starting a new life in Israel is a big move. So after people have this, basic ideology of moving to Israel, now when they're in Israel, they look around them, they look at the people, they look at the story. It makes perfect sense for me that people would say, I want to be more connected to my tradition, to my beliefs. It starts with something that was, like a lightning that says, I want to live in the land. And then it makes perfect sense. It's going to be developed into, I want to deeper the roots into my identity, into my belief system. So it makes perfect sense.
I would add to that, two different kinds of phenomenon that I am aware of. And again, I don't know that they're phenomenon as much as I know individuals that this has been their experience. So first of all, there are a number of Russian families that I know that made Aliyah, not recently, but a number of years ago, let's say 20, right after the Iron Curtain fell. There was a lot of Aliyah at that time. And people came for different reasons. Some people just came because they were sick of communist Russia and they were Jews, and they said, let's see what it feels like to live in a Jewish country. But I know a number of people that took that one step further, and when they came to Israel and they realized, wow, we're in a Jewish country, what does that mean? And they wanted to study Judaism, because in communist Russia, they were not exposed to that. They were not allowed to study. And as they studied, they became more observant. And there were quite a number of families in my own community that came to Israel in those years, in the 90s, and are, regular people today in our community. They're Orthodox Jews, but they weren't born that way. They didn't start out that way. And for each of them, it was an individual, search to discover more and more about who they really were. There's also another phenomenon that of Americans. Now, most American Jews who make Aliyah are not doing it for financial or reasons of persecution, because they're coming from a country where life is actually quite good for Americans, for Jews. But they're coming because they want to be part of Israel. And a lot of them are already religious Jews. But even religious Jews, when they come to Israel, their religion becomes something of a completely different dimension. And I can attest to that. I don't think there's been any change in my physical, technical, religious observance, or how I live my daily life in terms of religious observance. And, if I keep kosher, and, I did that in America too. But your feeling is that your Judaism is so much more immediate. And I don't know, what I like to say is, when you get to Israel, you realize God is no longer a long distance call, but a local call. And that's really, everything you do takes on such a more intense significance. And you also are enabling yourself to connect to your origins. You're not just reading the Bible as, oh, what happened then? You're reading the Bible and realize what happened then is what's happening now, and I'm living it. And that is an intense religious and spiritual experience that many new immigrants who come from, let's say, Western countries experience. And then there's one more kind of person that I have encountered, where Jews from many countries all over the world who are secular, but already in those countries start exploring what their Judaism means and come closer to religion already there, and then realize that the ultimate step in becoming a really religious Jew has to include making Aliyah. Because if you want to be a real committed totally whole and completed Jew, that means that has to include living in Israel, because you come to realize that this is where God is moving us. We're part of a redemption process, and you can't wake up and say, wow, I want to get closer to God and do what God wants, and then not get on the plane and move to Israel. So you're seeing these are the kinds of people that I have seen. Okay, I think we've handled all the questions, and we would love to be responsive. We look forward to being in Taiwan and meeting people, and hope that, anybody who has any kind of questions, please encourage all of them to ask us. We love engaging and sharing about our lives and our faith, and whatever it is that people want to know, even the nitty gritty of, well, how do kids go to school? It doesn't matter. Any kind of questions that come up, we are happy to answer them to the best of our abilities.
Absolutely, waiting forward. And there's a word we need to learn, Sandra. Sheshe. It's thank you. And in Hebrew,
really? Sheshe?
Yeah. Sheshe.
Sheshe. Okay, I got it.
And in Hebrew, we say toda. Thank you.
Toda.
Bye.